Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this webinar, which we're going to look at cybersecurity and risk management and how to avoid data breaches. My name's Simon Lacey, despite what it says on the screen, which says I'm Nick Frost, and I'm joined by my good friend Nick Frost for this afternoon session. We do invite feedback and questions throughout the event, so please don't sit there waiting on your questions. We'll pick up the answers at the end, though. So if something strikes you as we're chatting, please feel free. And if you want to disagree with us, that's absolutely fantastic. So the agenda we have on the screen there, fairly self-explanatory, I guess, for those of you who are webinar familiar. Nick and I will introduce ourselves. Then we're going to look at some of the security trends that we're seeing in our experience right now. And section 3, we look at assets and why they matter and understanding what matters to you. Look, section 4, understanding your threat landscape, and I think the important bit there is understanding your threat landscape, not just the threat landscape in general terms. Section 5, what does good look like for cyber risk management, and we'll conclude with a Q&A session at the end there. So as I've said, please fire those questions into us. We really would like to hear what you guys have to think, and we've also got a couple of polls throughout the event. So introductions. My name is Simon Lacey. I've got 20-something years experience, I believe, now in cybersecurity. I run a small limited company called Oliver Lacey, and I've some career highlights for me personally was working at the Bank of England in the Information Security Division on information security policy and also information governance in the NHS and in Bupa. Nick, over to you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I just want to do a quick audio check. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you absolutely fine, Nick.
Oh, good. If you can, then everyone else can, hopefully. Hi, everybody, and thanks all very much for joining. Okay, so a bit of background to me. Yeah, similar amount of years in cybersecurity, which is quite interesting because I think anyone who's been in cybersecurity for 25 years has seen a staggering amount of change. I'm one of the founders of Cyber Risk Management Group. A lot of my time has been spent with PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, as head of information risk for the group, and also as a researcher for the ISF Information Security Forum, who I recommend anybody who's looking for good practice, research, etc., to go and check them out. Two great organisations, and you know, I feel pretty fortunate that that I've been, and I'm sure Simon does, at the sort of forefront of a lot of the cybersecurity, cyber risk challenges, and that's really what we want to share with you today. We want to look at this area of cyber risk and look at it from a perspective of ISO as well, with the good understanding or complete understanding of how you can help reduce data breaches. And I say reduce rather than stop, because there's no such thing as 100% security, but there are some real good ideas, good practices that we will go through today. This will be quite interactive between Simon and I. I expect Simon to interrupt me in a number of occasions because I have a habit of chatting away. But we're also going to leave quite a bit of time at the end in terms of being able to answer some of the questions that you have. But let's start off with a trip down memory lane, if you like. And I think this is quite an interesting perspective, a narrative, if you like, because it highlights how our world in cybersecurity has evolved. And you know, none of this is rocket science, nothing groundbreaking here. But I do think it's important just for us to think back to how this has manifested itself. We know, you know, 30 years ago, you know, cybersecurity was not really a significant, or cyber risk was not really a significant risk for people and organizations. You know, we were less dependent on technology a very simple, reason factor, if you like. And a lot of the attacks were really about notoriety. You know, we had these hacking underground groups, people trying to make names for themselves. But things started to change fairly quickly. We started to see some high-profile attacks. Again, they were fairly limited in terms of the actual impact to organizations. We had Code Red, we had obviously this love letter virus, and that's when I think the attention by the media started to kick in, and that had I think that was a double-edged sword, because it started to highlight to those nefarious groups and nefarious individuals that actually, this is an activity that you can do without really being recognized, and potentially, there's some financial gains behind it. And I'm not going to suggest that 2008 was the kickoff when we saw financial, a motive, but it certainly was a time around about this time where the financial attractiveness, if you like, of cybersecurity was becoming a big problem for organizations. This is when the realization about, data could be monetized, data could be sold, and organizations had to really step up that game. And we saw this around about this time as well. What I would say is, between the left and the right, what we've seen, Simon and I, is a shift from a compliance-led approach to one that's much more risk-based. And we still need to comply to codes and standards and regulations, but a compliance-led approach to security only is no longer sufficient. It just isn't. You have to know what your key risks are to the organization, and we'll talk you through how you identify and understand that.
I think that's a great point, if I can just interject there. You talked about words, so I hate to disappoint you. If I look at my time sort of early in my time in cybersecurity, and perhaps I think sort of that illustrates your point there about a compliance-led approach. The primary vehicle for monitoring compliance was to return once a year a fax with 12 questions that said yes or no on it in one organization I was working for. And that was what, early 2000, 2002, 2003, something like that. So that's where we were then. And that's a comparatively short space of time. We've moved from there to this situation we find ourselves in now. So I think that tells you quite a lot about how the risk profile has changed, how much more risks there's been introduced in that time, Nick. And I'm sure you've seen similar.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also, one of the headaches businesses have with cyber risk. If you look at, I've worked with lots of risk disciplines in organizations, in particular legal, operational, financial risk. The sort of risk landscape doesn't change. It does change, but it's nowhere near as dynamic as cybersecurity. And I think businesses see cybersecurity as the new kid on the block in the risk space. And they're still trying to understand, well, so what does it mean for us? Now, I think in cybersecurity, that's our job to try and figure out what the ideal Rosetta Stone is. How can we translate this cyber risk to an operation risk? And this is all, these are all things we'll cover later. But just to finish off this slide, I just wanted to highlight that we, obviously, there's new technology. We're not trying to stop the new technology in organizations, but it is an area that is increasing the, if you like, the cyber blast zone, or the footprint, if you like, whatever term you want to use for security. And so it has to be managed very rigorously to prevent any major impacts to organizations. Simon, did you want to introduce this one?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting how that's changed, Nick. Is that I was reminded of a conversation I had with somebody a year ago where they said they'd had to update the firmware on their shower. And you think back to that 20 years ago when we first joined the industry, if you turn around and said, I've got to update the firmware in my shower, everyone looked like you were insane. But that's how the world has changed in those 20 years, I guess. And I think now we're looking at trends, and as Nick started out by saying about how we try and mitigate compromises or data breaches, etc., whilst acknowledging that we don't have 100% security unless we're going to put all our data in a concrete block and sink it somewhere in the North Sea or something. But actually, one of the things that really is at the forefront of this is actually the brand damage and the brand impact that there is of a data breach. And it's almost, if it's personal data that's breached, it's almost not the fine that is the issue, because it's in sort of certainly in terms of Europe with GDPR, etc., as a percentage of your turnover. But actually, it's the damage that caused to your organisational brand, which seems to be in the forefront of C-level, or the corporate level and director level organisations. They don't want to see that damage to the brand. And I think we could also talk about the likes of TalkTalk, where we'd have senior executives put in front of the media and answering questions and having to put out statements, etc. That's a really uncomfortable and embarrassing situation to be in for anybody. And of course, there's the financial aspects there. Again, if we look at some of the activity which has happened, which organisations worry about, which for organisations I talk to is not quite secondary, but it's the brand bit is the bit that drives it in my experience. And how over the years we've seen a real change in how the reporting lines work. So again, something I always look, Nick and I were talking about this morning, is that if I go and visit an organisation, one of the first things I do, I always like to get there quite early, so you can sort of scope out what their organisation looks like if I'm physically visiting site. If they've got their annual report and their reception area, which lots of organisations do, is to pick that up and having a flick through. And that gives you a really good idea about that organisation, what they really think of cybersecurity. And organisations now, sort of 10, 15 years ago, you wouldn't have had a separate section about cybersecurity, whereas now we see it there, and that's front and centre. That's front and centre of the organisation. It's in the annual report that people can pick up and read, and it will say what their commitment is, and that gives you a good flavour of what that organisation is endeavouring to do and how they want to secure it, and actually what their attitude is to risk more generally. Is that sort of thing you tend to see, Nick?
Very much. Yeah, I think just on the reporting line, I think that's a useful weather vane to determine, how, I suppose, not how serious the organisation's taking it, but how seriously it's being managed. And I've been in roles where I think the traditional reporting route is very much from the CISO to the CIO, and for lots of organisations that works still really well. Even to the CTO. But we are seeing changes in reporting line too. Maybe not, maybe it's more of a dotted line, if you like, to CRO. My experience in companies I've worked for, we had reporting lines into legal. And sometimes you need that. Sometimes you need those individuals that can champion your cause, because the reporting to executive, the decisions that get made by executive, the expectations on executive are very different, and sometimes it's just easier to have that connection, whether it's to senior steering committees, whether it's directly to the board. The other thing I think is worth highlighting is more generally, senior management and boards, they now get cybersecurity. They understand the consequences. There's plenty of media evidence anyway out there, so I'm not sure how they wouldn't. There's an expectation now that in security we're going to be doing something about it, and we come to this reporting aspect a little bit later on, because there are techniques in which you can report more effectively to boards. And I've had the goods and the bad experience. I'm quite happy to share my experience, what works very well. Just to a point you made earlier, Simon, I think organizations' transparency when it comes to cyber incidents is absolutely vital. We've seen so many cases on what not to do, and I'm not going to name names. Organizations that may be going through an acquisition and they don't declare certain incidents that they've had. I always refer to one of the best examples I've seen of transparency. I'm sure they don't mind me mentioning their name, was Maersk. Maersk was, high-profile organization who got hit by NotPetya. Their CEO was on, the news channels, the talk channels, very transparent, very clear message going out exactly what they're doing. And I think organizations can learn from that. because at some point, you're likely to be found out. So it's it's not a good idea to tell a lie. Be as transparent as you can if you get hit.
That's actually a really good point, Nick, isn't it? I think that if the worst does happen, understanding when's a good time to stand there and say we think we've got a problem is actually a quite a nuanced piece of work. And it is part of cybersecurity, but in a way it isn't. It's broader, and it's a communication thing there, isn't it? It's that understanding. Well, actually, we need to start telling people about this, because if you deny there's a problem, as you absolutely say, if you sit there in denial and then you get found out that it has happened, no one comes out of that looking good. So there's quite a lot of thought needs to go into that, depending on obviously the size and the criticality of the business, of the organisation, about what point you start telling your client base that you think you've had a problem, and actually what you're doing about it.
Yeah.
And I also like that bit there you said in the middle there, Nick, that slide with the CISO and the reporting lines, and something I see fairly frequently, and I'd be interested to hear what your view is on that, is that there should be a certain degree of tension between all these roles, because the roles are different, but there should be a certain degree of tension between. There should be challenge between those roles. There should almost not have one of those roles shouldn't necessarily be the whip hand, if you like, or in the lead position. There should be a tension and a chance to challenge each other and challenge the mindsets and the thinking. Is that something you see? I mean, I see that a lot.
Yeah, and I think to that point, you're absolutely right, and that's where I think steering committees come into play. In my experience, because the business needs to reach a consensus around cybersecurity. Yes, we can advise as cybersecurity experts and CISOs, but there needs to be a consensus, and it's a balance at the end of the day. There may be decisions by the organisation that requires them to take a higher degree of risk. They may need to get a service to market quickly. There may be other times when there may be some new regulation that delays certain projects or decisions around security. But those are massive decisions. They cannot be made by just one role. It has to be made by a committee. The trick is making sure you get that steering committee to operate effectively. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay.
So we've got the first poll now, and the question we'd like to ask you is: to what extent does your board grapple with cybersecurity as a real business risk? So, do you think that the board appointed a head of cybersecurity, job done? That B, they get the cyber risk is a big deal, but they prefer to leave it to me / us? Or C, they're all over it. We deliver regular risk updates that position cyber as an integral element of enterprise risk. So if we can just launch that poll there to give you the options to pick there. So as the board appointed a head of cybersecurity, so that's job done, nothing more we need to do. B, to get the cyber risk is a big deal, but they prefer to leave it all to me / us. So that to you guys. We'll see, they're all over it. They deliver regular risk. We deliver regular risk updates that position cyber as an integral element of enterprise risk. So just give you a few seconds to think that through. Don't overthink the response there, but we'd just be interested to see what you come up with and whether that measures up against what we come across on a daily basis, really. So give you a few more seconds there to make your choice of the three options you have there. Okay, perhaps if we could go to the results now.
I may need to pass that responsibility on to someone at PECB.
Have we got the results come through yet?
Yes, we have the results. 28% voted for the first answer, 37% voted for the second one, and 35% for the third one.
So that's a pretty even split there, Nick.
Yeah, that is. It's actually slightly better than I thought, to be honest with you. I didn't think we'd see too many of the B's and the C's, but that's actually really positive to hear. Good. All right. Well, look, we'll share all this this information to people that attend with a mini write-up anyway. Right. So, okay, we're talking about risk and cyber risk in particular. There's lots of elements to it, and Simon will talk to some more of those broader elements that make up the cyber risk management piece. Okay, the broader picture. What I want to talk about here, though, is the cyber risk assessment piece. And there's lots of methodologies and processes out there. Generally, they look a little bit like this. And I just want to talk broadly about each of those elements here. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but this is what a good practice approach to cyber risk assessment looks like. And it's predicated on, if you like, the risk equation. It looks at likelihood, it looks at impact. We can add in other components, you know, speed of risk or frequency, but let's just focus on the foundations. What is important about any cyber risk assessment process here, though, is that it's collaborative. It engages individuals in the organization, and it could be business representatives, ideally IT owners, system owners, IT custodians, whatever term you use. But I'll go through each of these steps, so it might tease out some of the roles that are key to this. The first one, which often doesn't get enough attention in my experience, is about clarifying the scope. So defining what it is you're assessing. And in our world at CRMG, I would say that roughly 85–90% of assessments that we do are at an application level. There could be a new system coming through, a systems development lifecycle, could be a critical system that's already identified, but that's typically what that asset that gets assessed. But getting that profile and the scope is important, because what you don't want to do is start, unless you've got the experience, start looking at the underlying networks, the data centers, and then all of a sudden your scope includes the whole internet. And that's no good. You start to normalize the data, you don't get good results. The second step is really about focusing on impact, and this helps you to define the criticality of these assets. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then we get into the world of assessing cyber threats. So this is an area that you can use a lot of good threat intelligence if you have it. There's lots of good open source intelligence. But when you're looking at threats, you must always think about your organization. And there's a couple of key questions you can ask yourself. If I was a hacker, what would I want to steal from my organization? What's the level of maturity of my organization? In other words, are we likely to see accidental mistakes taking place? And that's an important feature here. When we, say we, Simon and myself, when we speak to our clients, it's amazing to see that accidental threats are still a big problem for organizations. So whilst there's a lot of attention around the external and intentional threats, there's still a big problem with accidents happening in organizations. The next step is looking at your, if you like, your exposure, your vulnerability to those threats. So what controls have we got in place? What awareness programs have we got? What processes have we got so that we can respond to an incident effectively? Gone are the days when you can prevent incidents and threats with firewalls or IDS. We've now got to be in a sort of mindset, which is we will experience an attack at some point. How are we going to respond to that? So responding structurally and in a timely manner is really important. So that's all part of the control assessment. That then allows us to look at risk. So we can start to prioritize risk. We can start to look at the potential impacts, the likelihood, and that derives a cyber risk profile. Then we go into the remediation piece, okay? And determining the cyber risk and presenting the cyber risks, as well as presenting options for remediation, is absolutely vital, because what you don't want to do is to present to a steering committee or a business owner or a system owner, and they agree with all the cyber risks, and they turn around and say, what are you going to do about it? You've got to start thinking about what that remediation looks like. And that remediation is really about a negotiation, because this is where you can put your argument forward to say, well, you can have a platinum level service, but it will cost this amount and may lead to a lot of disruption in the organization, or you can go for, you know, a silver approach. But these are the decisions that need to be made by the organization. You know, as I say, our role is really as a facilitator and a provider and advisor of this type of information.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting, Nick. I think there's a number of things that popped up here. I've just scribbled on my pad next to me, and it's certainly sort of bringing the ISO angle to it. So firstly, scope. Actually, if you're doing a risk assessment, you need to tie your scope down, because what was the quote you just used? You know, you end up risk assessing the internet. And actually, ISO, that's equally important. You need to make sure you define your scope properly, and that can take a lot more time than you think it will. And of course, ISO, the changes on 27002 now, where threat intelligence is now included as one of the options there. And I think that's a really powerful statement, but actually quite difficult for perhaps small and medium-sized enterprises. They've now got to start thinking about threat intelligence. And the other thing that really struck me about this slide and this process is actually it really is a business-focused activity. So again, we've been around long enough that we used to try to do risk management, sat in our basements, you know, sat in our darkened corner, surrounded by box files, try and do risk assessments without really any effective input from the business because they weren't overly interested. IT might throw some stuff in there every once in a while. But this is really, to be effective, you absolutely have to get the business involved. If you don't include the business and what's important to the business, then everything you do is going to fall down and fail ultimately, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, indeed. And to that point about the engagement, that's why I think the reporting piece is also important. You know, making sure that, because you're going to have different audiences. You know, you're going to have audiences for control owners, risk owners, decision makers at the steering committee. You know, somebody in IT may want to have very defined, action-orientated things to do. You know, they may not be that fussed about, well, what risks they're mitigating. Just tell me what to do. Whereas individuals in the organization steering committee may want to understand what the aggregated risk looks like, because there may be such a big transformation project or an acquisition that's going on that actually decides, you know, how they approach those types of strategic engagements based on what we see as an aggregated risk.
Yeah, and of course that reporting,
okay.
It needs to be the right information going to the right people, isn't it? I guess ultimately, I mean, again, you and I must have seen enough risk reports, which are, you know, there's a chance for us to go and talk to the board about risk, and I've got 7 minutes. I produce 75 slides, and of course that you know, that's just bombarding people with detail they don't need. They need to know where that link is in terms of what the business does and what the impact on the business is, which I guess is almost a seamless link to this slide, Nick, isn't it? Really. Yeah, so the business impact table. So this is a way of understanding the assets that really matter to you. And again, this is such a business-focused piece of activity. You know, I would expect to see, for example, finance. You'd expect the director of finance to have some input into what this looks like and what you know. Okay, well, we could live with something that's under £100,000, for example. And I've had some conversations with some fairly small enterprises, sort of, well, I guess micro businesses employing less than 10 people. And actually that financial aspect of what a cyber attack could have, impact it could have on them, is really significant, because you're talking there some quite small figures, which helps set that. You know, if you're a big business, you can sit and go, okay, that costs us £1 million. We do care, but we don't care that much. If you're a small business, it might be down to sort of tens of thousands of pounds that actually you can't live with. Reputation, you'd expect some input there, perhaps from the comms team, perhaps from sales team, for example, to have some kind of conversations around that. The regulatory might well be the legal team or legal counsel that would have there, or if you work in a highly regulated industry such as financial services, for example, you may take some FCA or PRA guidance there and start folding that into what your conversations look like. And And of course, I guess almost the most important one is health and safety. And again, people don't necessarily think of that necessarily in the context of cyber, but actually, if the business ends up not functioning as it should do, does that have any knock-on effects elsewhere? So this is part of this bigger picture that we need to think of, and they're all inputs that we really need from the business, and they're the conversations. So again, I have so many conversations with cyber teams and information security teams and organizations. You have to be active in the business. You have to have a route within the business. You must know people in the business. One of the key things I used to do in one of the organizations I worked for is that, almost a rule. You wouldn't send an email to somebody. You'd send an email saying, right, I'll meet you for a coffee in half an hour. And then we go to the coffee bar on the 6th floor or whatever and go and have a coffee and have a conversation about these things, rather than this almost slightly anonymous exchange that you have sat in your darkened room. So this conversation in terms of framing your risk, this is what the impact would be on your organization should things go wrong, and how high that risk appetite is going to be. I don't know how you find these, Nick, but I always find these sort of quite inexact conversations, really. They're all quite, it's difficult to get a definition. It's all quite woolly, and there's almost that gut feel kind of conversation. Well, my feeling is it'd be this, high reputation coverage for over a week, but it's not defined. It's not exact.
Yeah, and it can be, and I think it's easy to critique something like this, as you say, because it's not deemed to be highly accurate. I think just a couple of points. On a personal level, and I think I speak about most of the consultants at CRMG. This is it's a useful vehicle, this, to get a conversation going. But there's some hints and tips on how to get something that's realistic, and that's the key point. You should look at these reference tables, and your organization should be a reflection of what you see here, as close as you can be. What I would suggest, though, is, as Simon said, when you're looking at filling one of these out, don't get everyone in a room. That's a disaster, and I've experienced that myself, whereby the COO and the CFO arguing over the same thing. So go one-to-one, sit with the CFO or a representative of the finance, and start to work this out. Same with operations, same with legal for regulatory. You won't get this right first time. You need to go through this for a number of iterations, and I'll be honest with you, probably about 6 months until you actually land on something that's representative of the enterprise. Now, so that's one point I wanted to highlight. But just very quickly, to make this work in practice, and this is a real skill for the cyber risk analyst, we need to go through a set of scenarios based on the asset we're looking at, because that then brings it to life, so that people in these workshops, and that's how it really should be run as an impact, workshop, impact assessment workshop. If you bring that to life with scenarios, then you can start to get some really good information about the types of consequences that could occur. And the litmus test sometimes is when you see people in the business with their eyes opening or starting to shift uncomfortably in their chair, because they've not actually figured out that this critical system that would knock out their process, that would leave them, create a world of pain from them as individuals, suddenly lands with them. So it's a really useful vehicle, and it's standard step in any risk assessment. Okay, again, there's nothing groundbreaking here, but there are some tools and techniques like these impact reference tables that can really help shape the conversation and get an objective assessment.
I find quite useful to, once you've had some one-to-ones, is almost boilerplate up something like this and then take it to the workshop to finalize it. Because I think if you try and get, if you try and get everybody in the room to have a conversation, people get absolutely hung up on the fact, well, should low be less than 100,000 or should it be 120,000? And you find 20 minutes later, you're still talking about that. You're not raising it out. And another point, I worked with a client recently and about the financial aspects, and actually bringing in like the director of operations or head of operations, because actually their job was to ensure the output from the production line. And actually, if their production line stops, the financial impact was absolutely massive, even though what they were producing was relatively low value, but because so much goes out. And it's getting that multi-dimensional bit. So actually, there's always that real bit of effort needs to go into planning who you need to talk to, and it's not always the most obvious people. So I fell into the say, well, director of finance, but it might not. It might be the director of finance and somebody else to get that necessary multi-dimensional view of it all. And I think people look at that sometimes think that's really easy and a quick piece to do, and in my experience, it always takes longer than you think it's going to take. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Nick, but
yeah, but I like what you said there, which is, these conversations, the way you can structure this format and the conversations is almost a sequence of events. So you don't have a financial impact right away. You have an operational impact. That leads to, potential complaints from customers, starts to hit your reputation. Then the regulatory people get involved, and suddenly, you've got 30 auditors on site and you're having to manage them. The impact then hits financial. So you end up with, I quite like that. It's like a business sequence of what happens if an incident does take place. And that's important because, managing a major incident is not always just cybersecurity. You're going to have your spokesperson that needs to be primed and know what to say. That's the senior management. You may have account managers that need to reach out to key clients and advise them on what's going on. It's one of those sort of, it's one of those risks that involves a lot of people. And the more that we know and the more that we can gauge, and this is an ideal engagement tool to be able to facilitate that, the better.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that's because this is the impact on the business. This is ultimately what it's all about, isn't it? Understanding what impact would be on the business, and some of this impact could actually result in the business no longer existing. So this is what this bit is, a leap off point. It is really, really important. And again, it's not a cast in stone. We do it once and never look at it again. This almost needs to be a regular churn of going, okay, well, we've grown. We employ now 3 times as many people as we did 12 months ago. What does it look like now? And actually, that to keep going back at that touchstone again. Okay, is it still good for us? I'm sorry, just keeping on the time. I guess we need to move on. Any questions? But don't forget to ping down any questions for Nick and I as we're going through this session here. Let's look at the threats now, then, Nick.
Yeah, I'm just gonna. I mean, as I say, I'm not going to cover all of the steps in the process for a risk assessment I showed before, but there are a couple I just want to highlight because these are, this is where we tend to see the most questions and challenges around the impact, how you can start to assess that, and also looking at the threat landscape. I think this is a particularly challenging area, mainly for small and medium enterprises that may not have the the luxury of threat intelligence, and even organizations we work with that do have threat intelligence, it doesn't always answer the kind of key questions that I always have in my mind, which is who wants to attack us, and what types of techniques would they use? Because if you start to understand that, you can start to diagnose the problem and look at the controls to be able to put in place. But there are a couple of things I think are worth noting here. One is you've got to take a good look at your organization. Just understand, basic components of your organization. What's a sort of, what's a critical data that we have that keeps this business going? What are the key, if you look at the key properties, are we an e-commerce organization where availability is key? Are we in a sector that may be targeted? Are we, a supplier to a defense contractor? So, and those types of elements of your business will often lead to, if you like, the type of maybe threat actor that may target your organization. Maybe the types of motivational factors. Is it geopolitical? Is it financially driven? But that then starts to help shape your threat landscape. And similar to the impact assessment that we talked about before, this is not an activity that you will do once and it will be 100% perfect. It isn't. You've got to go through this in an iterative manner. And if you've got open source intelligence, there's lots of really good open source intelligence out there, and it's well worth taking a look at that, because it may start to give you a slightly different view about, well, realistically, what are the threats to our organization? So that's what I'd say on that point. Anything from your side on that, Simon?
Yeah, I think that's the importance of spending time making sure they're relevant threats to you. I think I remember having a conversation a number of years ago now with an organisation, and their question was whether they would have to, what was it, whether they'd have to consider risks as a typhoon because it was on a standard threat list. And it's like, well, the part of the country they lived in the UK, I said, when was the last time you had a typhoon? They said, well, we've never had one. So then you don't need to worry about it then, do you? Because it's going to be an extremist event that would happen, I don't know, once every 1,000 years or something. And actually that's one of those, you know, those events you probably don't, there's more relevant things for you to spend your time worrying about or thinking about. And I think the threat, this is something I find small businesses tend to find quite scary.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot out there, and actually I've also seen a lot of organizations that completely disregard threats. So they try and work out their likelihood without even thinking about what the threats are, and they end up with a simple, you know, a matrix of likelihood and impact. But actually, if you start asking questions about it, that's really been a case of rolling a dice and saying, well, okay, that's a 2 or a 3. There's not that thought that's gone into that. And of course, I think as you mentioned earlier, Nick, about the insider elements, you know, well, it's called negligence, and I'm not sure if that's probably a term that will probably change in the years to come. But somebody just going and making a mistake because they're under pressure on a Friday afternoon to deliver something from a senior manager and their colleague's not in, they're really busy, they push the button and something untoward happens. And that's all part of that consideration that needs to go into this. But as you said, there's some good tools out there to help, and either low cost or free of charge, that can help shape those conversations, aren't there?
Yeah, there are a lot of useful stuff out there. Okay.
Yeah, so Nick and I were chatting about this slide earlier, and about how you could prioritise this, and how you'd look at this and say, okay, well, they're the bits I really think are really important to us, important to think about. And for me, there's a couple of things there about assets identified is something that I have a bit of bee in my bonnet about the assets being identified, because how many times you ask an organisation, what information assets do you have? And there's a slight, they go, oh, well, we know we've got so many laptops and so-and-so's got an iPhone, but no, what about data? What about things that are critical to you? And there's always this moment where the penny drops with, actually, we're not talking just about hardware, we're talking about the data. And actually, because the hardware is almost irrelevant, it's the data that's the important bit, because that's allows you can replace hardware relatively easily. You can't necessarily replace data, and data is the bit of value. And for me also, I do, again, perhaps it can come across from the other sections we've talked about, but having the right stakeholders involved into that. I think all these conversations you have, and they're trying to done in a bit of a silo without the relevant people, you're never going to come up with the right answer, because it's not the people who really understand. So Nick, in your slide earlier, you have system owners on there, for example. Well, the system owner would hopefully understand what their system contributes to the business as part of the whole, whereas the cybersecurity team probably aren't going to have that knowledge. They can probably guess, and they might be relatively close, but equally they may be a million miles away. And I think those two elements for me are fundamentally important. It's, if I'm talking to a small or medium-sized business, which I have been doing recently, about getting onto a journey of having grown from employing 2 people out of a spare room kind of thing to employing 6, 7 people and some freelancers, but actually, you know, there's some of the steps they have to take to try and move themselves forward at perhaps a gentle pace, but to move themselves forward from going from almost this sole trader type arrangement to something a bit more sustainable. But I don't know your thoughts. Anything on there particularly? I mean, I guess we could talk about each of those individually for probably about 20 minutes each anyway, but any sort of snapshots? I think.
I think, I mean, basically, you know, if you're serious about cyber risk and cyber risk management, you don't just think about the methodology and the process. It is important, very important, but there's other factors you need to consider to make this a success. And dare I say it, it's a little bit like running a little business, if you like. You know, you've got to train staff in this area. You've got to be able to sell the initiative of cyber risk, because you're going to need support from the organization. You're going to need to generate outputs that are valuable to the business. All really basic stuff, but sometimes, it's a little bit like taking your driving test after driving 30 years. Sometimes we forget some of these basic features, but they're incredibly powerful to make sure you get in place, because these are the success factors to a good overall cyber risk management capability.
And that's a great point there on methodology, Nick. I think if we boil it down to small business, your risk management processes and methodology must serve the business. You can go out there and, the ISF does IRAM2, which is a fantastically comprehensive tool. But if you're a small or medium-sized enterprise and you said, let's take you on the IRAM2 journey, they would go very white very quickly and probably faint, because they'd never get to the end of that process. It's not proportionate for their business.
Yeah, I think so what we've done here is we've condensed, if you like, our, I don't know how many years, 40 plus years of experience into one slide. I think there's a couple of key features here that we want to highlight. Certainly, as Simon said, focus on the systems and those data assets that are critical to your organization. I think understanding a practical process that incorporates the fundamentals of information risk, that's important, because you want to be able to, whatever process and approach you develop, you want to be able to hook it to known principles, whether it's ISO, NIST, whether it's FAIR. There's lots of good methodologies out there, but they largely all adhere to those key areas such as impact or consequence and likelihood or probability. You're going to, at some point, look at evaluating GRC products. What I would suggest, though, is that shouldn't be something you do right away. It's worth looking at establishing, some of the basics in this area first before you start to look at those enterprise-wide GRC products, or maybe look at some of the more, smaller products out there in the marketplace that can get you going early on in your journey. One of the points there about a phased approach, absolutely, and we'll come to this on one of the last slides. Look at sort of a pilot project proof of concept. Make your mistakes early on and make sure those mistakes are part of a pilot, because you are going to learn a lot, and it's better to understand those before you start to roll this out across the organization. I think the last one there, a lot of organizations that may be your own clients, maybe people you partner with, a risk-based approach in security is seen as a very positive activity. It's a significant undertaking, don't get me wrong. It's not an easy thing to do, but it is certainly achievable. And it helps you target where investment's needed. It helps to highlight the risks. You can diagnose challenges to the organization and security much more effectively than you can with a compliance-led approach. So that's just a sort of a summary of our 30, 40, 50 years experience. Simon, do you want me to take this one? I think we're running out of time. We want to get.
Yeah, I'm just keeping an eye on the time there.
So okay, I think we've sort of pretty much covered this one. But prioritizing the risk, that's absolutely something you've got to do. I think you will not achieve a remediation for all the risks that you identify, but it's important to be able to prioritize those and pick out those that really matter to your organization or to the service or to the business unit. When you do start thinking about remediation options, it's always a good idea to put forward different options, because in my experience, the number one factor that businesses will be concerned about is disruption. So it's not always money, it's disruption. If we put this solution in place, or you want me to train 1,000 people in this or whatever, what's the utilization, what's the disruption to their day-to-day business? That's a big problem. So give them options, give them an option that, okay, there's an option here that you can pay for that doesn't cause disruption, or there's an option that's halfway house. That's important to do. And I think when you look at those business obstacles that you're helping organizations to achieve, that the risk piece that we're doing in cybersecurity is very important. because they may be looking to, provide this application or service to market very quickly. There may be a decision to say, okay, we're going to mitigate some of the risk. We go to market and we'll start to remediate the risk once it goes live. That's not an ideal solution sometimes, but it's maybe a perfectly applicable business decision that can be made.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the we'll probably skip the polls. I think we're running short on time actually, Nick. But something that always strikes me in terms of this level of honesty that we need as a business when we're assessing risks and where we are and what we're good at and what we're not good at. We can sit there and deny that we've got issues, but the bad guys won't believe your denial. They'll just go ahead and disrupt you or cause the harm to you that they want to do. And again, that's something I've seen, perhaps less so now, but a while ago, it was sort of 10 years plus ago, it was almost quite common to deny that you had any issues with your policies or that you had a good understanding of everything. Everything was perfectly in place. And I wouldn't mind betting that every organisation has some gaps. I think we don't have this perfect solution, really, in my experience. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, you're talking about gaps here in the cyber risk program.
Yeah, well, just in terms of all your governance or all your security arrangements, perhaps more generally, broadly, everything's perfect. We just tell the board everything's working really well, and yeah, okay, great, but is it really?
Yeah, I mean, well, as I said, transparency is really important, whether it's to clients or internally. So yes, if there are gaps in your program, that's fine. They need to be brought to attention. I think they need to be weighed up though. There's always the attractiveness of going after a new shiny product or a service. But you've got to be able to qualify the need for that product and service. If it's a security service, security product for addressing a risk. So everything really has to have an element of risk baked into decision-making processes, whether it's acquisition, whether it's changes, whether it's maybe cancelling a key IT project. There's just too much risk associated with it. But yes, there are all gaps in how we manage security in organisations, for sure.
I think it's for that moment when you sit there with senior management and someone turns around and says to you that, well, we don't have any appetite for risk. And that's kind of all the time when you start getting a bit worried, isn't it? Because it's like, well, okay, if you want no risk, then you're going to have to spend a lot of money to get, and you still won't get.
No, not at all. Yeah, indeed. I think, Simon, just to finish off so we can try and jump into some questions and answers here. I just wanted to present this slide. This is something Simon and I worked on earlier because we're trying to say, okay, what is a project plan for this risk-based approach to try and obviously reduce incidents? I know we're talking about data breaches, but incidents in general. And we talked before about the importance of that, if you like, cyber risk ecosystem and creating that ecosystem. An absolutely key part of that is assessment, but there's also aspects around training and education, business awareness, getting that off the ground, being able to demonstrate the business value of a risk-based approach. And there's some really useful areas there, such as being able to target where investment's needed, which is much more effective than a compliance-led approach. Conducting pilot assessments. So when you start to do your cyber risk assessments, choose some well-known applications, find some champions in the business, go through the process, whether you're using methodologies developed by the ISF like IRAM2, whether it's ISO, whatever methodology is out there, choose one that's robust and rigorous. Customizing the data sets. This is something you will do over time. So once you've done 5 or 6 risk assessments, you'll start to get an idea of what are the key threats to your organization. And you need to preserve that. You need to start building these libraries of threat templates for different types of technologies. You also need to look at the governance aspect. So you need to start identifying if there's already existing steering groups, maybe a risk review board, for example, that's a prime opportunity for you to come in with your knowledge of cyber risk. And you can start to look at how that affects other risk disciplines that get discussed continuously in this particular board. Then you start to see, and this is our experience with seeing and working with organizations over many years, then you start to see, the product assessment, product evaluation, because they are powerful tools. You can start to aggregate the data. That allows you to take a much more strategic approach, using risk as a key feed into those decisions. So as a very high level project plan, anybody who's out there starting on this journey, feel free to take this and use it to your advantage. Simon, anything you want to touch on there? Sorry, we've got 5 more minutes, so we can certainly squeeze in some questions.
I don't know if we've had any questions come through as yet. I mean, I've got a couple here. If there's any more, it might be useful just to just leap onto those if that's okay, Nick.
Yeah, sure.
Right. What would be okay? We may have touched on this. I think this came in slightly earlier, but how does a small and medium-sized enterprise start this journey? I guess some of the bits you just talked about there may well have already fed into that. But where would your leaping off point be for you, Nick?
For me, it would definitely be about identifying critical assets, those mission critical assets. Start to, and that is not something you can do without a discussion with people in the organization. So you might need some, preparation before about why you're doing this, because you're not going to secure everything. You certainly want to know what are those critical assets that do need to be secured. And you'll be amazed at actually what you find out is a critical asset. Whenever I've done these activities, I've always come away from these meetings thinking, I had no idea that was a critical asset. Now I understand why it is. But it's a really, really useful start to a discussion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And actually, there is often a perception that's actually really difficult. And I'm not decrying it and saying it's really easy. But if an organisation is to find its requirements for CIA, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability, that can almost be your leaping off point. Could be that just what have you defined those to be, and that could be a starting point. And actually, what you'll often find that might feed back in that actually, well, we've said this is what critical confidentiality looks like. It might not be quite that. We've over-egged that, or we said that's too important. I don't know, if you're a small business, that's the kind of conversations you need to have. And you're absolutely right, Nick. Sometimes the things you think are going to be the critical information assets, when you start working, you sit there and go, well, actually, it's not that at all. It's something over there that supports that. It's not that any. And that's quite interesting. And of course, don't forget that changes over time. So if it's a new product launch, for example, what critical while you're developing, and then once it's in the public domain, it's no longer critical to you. So it's a continual process. Well, hopefully that kind of helps that. Actually, we'll call another question there, but I'm not sure we can answer that in a minute. So, Joe, I'd love to have done. Any closing thoughts for you, Nick, that you'd like to add there?
I would recommend organisations think very seriously about this risk-based approach. If you are, an organisation that's usually has a security function that's very compliance-led, transitioning, and we're not talking about removing compliance, not at all, we can't, but we are saying it is important to embellish your current approach with a risk-led approach. It's becoming more important to be able to know where to target your investment. It's important to know how to figure out which risks you're most likely to respond to. And actually, that's a question I wanted to tease out. I wondered if you could tease out a bit more, Simon, which is, 20 years ago, we never really had to worry about responses to cyber attacks, not as much as we do now. And I wondered if you could share some experience around, cyber simulations that you've been involved in, because I think knowing how to respond effectively is becoming more important for organizations today.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, in just a few seconds, really, we've got that. Is that cyber exercises are a great way of helping you understand what's really important to you and how you should respond, I guess, when things go wrong. I know we like to talk about if things go wrong, but when things go wrong. And actually, when you start looking at a realistic scenario, if you work that scenario up to effectively reflect how the business works, you inevitably find stones that you lift, and there's things there you hadn't thought about. So actually, the comms team finishes at 2 o'clock on a Friday. Well, what happens if it happens at 6:30 on a Friday evening, for example. It can be as simple as things like that, that people start to go, do you know what? We never thought, Howard, because we're a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday business, we didn't think about having to do that at the weekend when on Twitter a story breaks that we've been hacked. It can really be as simple as that. But yeah, I really recommend doing cyber exercises. They sound incredibly complicated and long-winded, but they don't have to be. They can be simple, effective, and really punchy with the right people in the room. And they give you such a rich amount of data to fold back into the business. And they're great fun to run, really. If you run them properly, they can be really good fun to run too. So I guess we're out of time now. Nick, thank you. Thank you for your time today. I enjoyed chatting. I could talk for another couple of hours on this, but our contact details are at the bottom there, so feel free to reach out and speak to the two of us. And thanks very much for listening to us today.
Thanks, everybody, and good luck.
Thank you very much, Simon and Nick, for presenting today, and thank you everyone for your attention. Please be informed that this session is recorded and will be posted on our website and YouTube channel along with the slides of the presentation. Thank you all, and looking forward to the upcoming session.
Thank you. Bye now.